Hello, everybody. Welcome to the third episode of the Mini Albums podcast by Zigentala. Hello, my name is Lilith and I'm your host. I'm also the creator behind Zigentala and the creator behind the Zigentala mini album series on social media. How are you all doing? I hope you're doing well. It is the third week of January. I hope you have all brought in new, fresh energy into the new year. This is the time, though, when New Year's resolutions are being abandoned. And I just want to say, if this is you, if you made a New Year's resolution and you've already slipped up, do not give up. I don't know if it's just something that's human in us, that like if something isn't perfect, it isn't worth doing. And that is something I've had to learn a lot with my own creative process, because if I had shut out anything in my life that was not perfect or I didn't execute 100% perfectly, I would probably not have created or shown the world anything. So if you've slipped up on your New Year's resolutions, keep on going. Life is really messy, but you've just got to work with it. You got to live with it, work with it, and just keep on going. Anyway, that's my little small talk that I've said that I need to insert at the beginning of the podcast. So yeah, welcome. Welcome to the Mini Albums podcast. Today we're going to be talking about Currents by Tame Impala. I'm really excited to be going into this, guys, because I love this album. And I've listened to it many times in the shower, which is probably the best place to listen to psychedelic music. Much like a lot of the episodes, much like the two episodes we've had before this one, this podcast is going to be split into three different sections. First section, I'm going to be talking about the album. Second section, we're going to be looking into what you guys had to say. I posted a reel and a story this time, and I got a massive collection of answers, which I'm really excited to get into. And then the third section, we're going to be looking into a topic revolving or loosely related to the album. And today I want to look into the roots of the psychedelic movement, which if you know Tame Impala, you know that they're a very psychedelic influenced sound. We're going to be looking into the psychedelic movement and then looking into how it emerged within a counterculture in the 1960s. And I feel like it is very important to observe what happened in the 1960s and this counterculture that essentially went on to revolutionize society. I think it's important because while I was doing this research, I found a lot of parallels between the 1960s and the 2020s at the moment. And I want to pose the question of, are we currently living in a counterculture, or will we see the emergence of a counterculture in this decade? Because there is a lot of parallels between the turmoil and the tension within society in the 1960s that sort of created this counterculture. And I feel like we're living in that today. So we're going to be looking at that. So sit down, buckle up, get ready. And I guess we're probably just going to jump straight on into it, guys. So, Currents by Tame Impala. We're just going to start out with a foundation of stats, specs of the album. So, Currents is the third studio album by Tame Impala, released in July of 2015. It was released by Modular Recordings, which is an Australian record label under Universal Music Australia, which is obviously then a division of Universal Music. So then when the album was released in other countries, it was released under labels within the Universal Music Group, most notably by Interscope in the US and Fiction Records in the UK. Currents was the first #1 album for Tame Impala and charted as #1 in the Australian ARIA albums charts. Currents also charted at #1 on the Dutch Top 100 in the Netherlands and #1 in the US Top Alternative Album charts. In regards to the recording lineup, we just have one person, and that is Kevin Parker, a multi-instrumentalist from Western Australia. So if you don't know, or maybe you do, or maybe you were like me in that the first 5 years that I was listening to Tame Impala, I thought it was a band. It's not. It's actually just one person. So Kevin Parker did all of the songwriting, performing, mixing, and producing of this record, which is pretty bloody impressive. I believe he didn't do the mastering though. And because we are the Mini Albums podcast, I need to mention the album artwork. So it was creatively conceptualized by Parker, but made by Robert Beatty, which is an American visual designer and musician who has also made other album covers for other artists. While I was researching this guy, I found that he did the album cover for Rainbows by Kesha, which was released in 2017, which also has a very psychedelic feel. So you should definitely check out that artist if you're into psychedelic art, because the album cover for Currents is pretty funky. I really like it. Hence why I painted it. Although, mind you, if you try to paint it in a 5 centimeter square, oof, that is difficult. Okay, so Tame Impala is one of my favourite bands. Has been for a very long time now. As I've mentioned before, Tame Impala is very much known for its heavily influenced psychedelic sound. Very reminiscent of, that psychedelic aesthetic and sound that came out of the late 1960s to the 70s. But I would place Tame Impala into a more neo-psychedelic genre. Tame Impala is from Perth, Western Australia, and I think that something was cooking. Something was cooking in Perth for about a decade, because we saw, especially in Australia in the local scene, a lot of bands, neo-psychedelic bands that sort of revived psychedelic music. Tame Impala is obviously one, and Tame Impala also has close ties with the band Pond. I think that they did help on the 2 previous albums before Currents. You've also got bands Gum, Mink Muscle Creek, and also one of my other favourite bands, the Psychedelic Porn Crumpets. So they all came out of Perth in sort of the same decade, which would have been like the 2010s. And I just think that's something really interesting to observe, because last episode we did look at the Palm Desert music scene and how we saw a lot of bands sort of emerge at a particular time. Going from Kyuss to Queens of the Stone Age and Eagles of Death Metal and all of these other ones. And I feel like you could draw parallels between Perth and the Palm Desert music scene, because Perth is quite an isolated area of Australia. You've got the whole East Coast, and then you've got Perth right on the other side. So I haven't looked into it too much, but it's just an interesting thing to sort of look where Tame Impala came from and how it wasn't just sort of one band at one time. It was sort of part of this little re-emergence of psychedelic music in Perth. So, before Currents, Tame Impala did release 2 other albums. First one was Inner Speaker, which was released in 2010, and then you have Lonerism, which was released in 2012. These are both very earthy and grounded psychedelic music, and they're sort of really rooted in a lot of guitar and bass, and I think is very reminiscent of like that Woodstock sound. Fuzzy, distorted guitars, very much driving the songs. You've got very organic drums and distorted, funky bass. I remember hearing about Tame Impala in 2013 for the first time, and someone described them to me as a mixture between Pink Floyd and the Beatles, and that's very much the sound that these albums encapsulate before Currents. What I want to mention, though, is that I think in Lonerism, Parker really sort of started to explore more melody and created more melodic pop songs. That's when we saw songs like Feels Like We Only Go Backwards, Elephant, and Mind Mischief. And the reason I want to mention that is that because I feel like Currents is still psychedelic music, but it's very much veering in the direction of pop. It still has that heavy psychedelic feel to it, but this album goes in a completely different direction and creates its sort of own aesthetic. There's more melodic ideas being explored by Parker. You've got these characteristics of the driving guitars that created a lot of the sound in the last 2 albums. They sort of take a back seat, and we've got much more of a presence of synths. We've got a lot more electronic intervention in the production. The drums give off a very drum machine-y feel. You've got a lot of dramatic effects being used, like panning filters to sort of like disorientate you. And I feel like we also see a bigger presence of lyrics from Parker. And he does that by removing a lot of the effects that he uses on his vocals from the last 2 albums. He gets rid of those, and I feel like you can hear his voice a lot more clearer, and he can sort of communicate these lyrics in Currents a lot more effectively. So if I could compare Currents to the first 2 albums of Tame Impala, I would definitely say that the first 2 albums were very like earthy, they were very grounded, they were very much like that sort of that foundation of, psychedelic rock that emerged in the late 60s to mid 70s. And then Currents is sort of like flipped up, it's in the air, it's sort of like you're traveling through space and time. Which, of course, is very much a characteristic of psychedelic music. You know, psychedelic music was created to reproduce that feeling of being on a psychedelic drug, which usually means that you are going through something like depersonalization, which means, you know, a loss of sort of self, a loss of being connected into reality, into your body, this sort of derealization. And Currents definitely creates that feeling within this album, but it doesn't alienate the listener too much. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is the synths in this album. Oh my god, there are so many. There's such a wide palette. I feel like the presence of the synths really even almost pushed this album into like synth pop. You know, you've got pads, you've got leads, you've got like string staccatos, you've got like these laser gun synths, you've got these twinkling bell synths. Like, there's so many. And I literally feel like I'm a kid in a candy store. Because to me, synths are like, it's like a tiny dopamine hit when I hear like a really good synth. And just hearing the, you know, the spectrum of synths that Parker used to create this album. You know, they're just so delicious and delectable. You can almost compare them to all these different sorts of candies. And I feel like I'm a kid. I've got a bag of candies or lollies, and like I'm just like sifting through them, eating them. And that's what like Currents is to me when I hear all of these different amazing sounds. So as a general explanation for like my non-music people, so synths are the product of sound synthesis, and sound synthesis is something that you can do on a synthesizer or something that you can do on a digital program now. And basically what you can do is you create your own sounds using different sound waves, and there's lots of different sound waves like sine wave, triangle wave, sawtooth wave, square wave, and basically you can experiment, you can put all these together, you can just take one sound wave and you can work off of that, or you can stack them all on top of each other, and then you sort of use things like filters, different oscillators to sort of mold that sound into what you want it to be. But yeah, you can create a massive range of synths. And I actually found an online resource, which is really cool. It's called reverbmachine.com. And if you look on their blog, they actually have a breakdown of all of the different synth sounds in popular music and how you can recreate them. And on this resource, I actually found the synthesizer that Parker used on Currents. And it turns out that Parker really sort of relied on two synthesizers for this album. One of them is a Roland Juno 106, which is a polysynth from the 80s. And then he also has a Roland JV 1080, which is a digital synth that is sort of more of a 90s feel. I'm sure that there were other programs and things that he used, but those seem to be the two that get mentioned the most within these blog posts. And they really go on to recreate these sounds that Currents have. And there are so many, you know, if I could just like point out a couple of like my favorite synth moments is like, you know, it's like those atmospheric synth pads in the beginning of Yes, I'm Changing, you know, and then they've got these like glistening, sparkly synths that sort of come around in the second chorus. Or you've got this twinkling bell synth in 'Cause I'm a Man. Or even, I think this is actually one of my favorites, it's like a space laser. It has like a little introduction melody in the beginning of Past Life. Oh my god, that synth just sends me. Like, doing this podcast has made me realize how much I love listening to synth sounds. I feel like that was one of the things that really drew me to Demon Days by the Gorillaz, like the lead synth in Dirty Harry. I was like permanently fixated on that sound for like the first week of hearing it when I was like 10 years old. Because yeah, it just like scratches your brain in like just like the perfect place. I basically love a lot of the synths that they do in Gorillaz. You know, the second half of the song Empire Ants as well on their album Plastic Beach is really good. The synth in the opening sequence of Genesis by Grimes as well. Oh my god. Like, I'm on the floor. You know what as well? The opening title of Stranger Things. Oh my god. I have no emotional investment in this TV show. Like, I tried to watch it, I couldn't get into it, but the opening titles, oh my god. That opening music sends me. I love it so much. Also, Take On Me, that lead synth in Take On Me. Banger. Just looking at the absolute like spectrum of synths that Parker uses in this album, really, I feel like it really also helps to create that sort of that time and space feeling. It is sort of like you're traveling through space, and he uses them a lot as well to disorientate you. Think about like, you know, the first 10 to 20 seconds of the song Nangs. You know, it's just like this, I guess it's sort of like a pad, and then it's just got this wah 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 sound, which I would believe is a low frequency oscillator. And it's basically the same principle as like, you know, if you play a song on your iPhone and you put your mouth over the speaker and then you just like, you open and close your mouth really fast, you have the same sort of effect. And basically what it's doing is it's opening up the spectrum of frequencies within the synth and then closing it back up again, which is making that wah 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 wah. I love all of these examples I'm making with my voice. And the synths are really the thing that sort of comes in and fills out the songs, which is why I think Parker really sort of took a back seat with a lot of the guitars that he usually uses to drive his songs, especially in the last two albums he's released. In regards to the bass still plays a pretty integral part. There's a lot of really sort of funky bass lines that are used to root a lot of the tracks, because the synths that are being used take up pretty much that mid to high frequency range. And then the bass, I think, is used a lot to bring in a little bit more groove and syncopation, because when you listen to the drums of a lot of the tracks, I only realized this like yesterday, they're very much like a drum machine, and that's most evident when you listen to the introduction of the third track, which is The Moment. And I think he played the drums, he recorded them, and then he sampled it, and then he sampled those through a drum machine to sort of give it that electronic beat feel. If you listen to The Moment, as I said, the third track, The Moment, if you listen to like the introduction to that and then listen to like the drums that are played on Mind Mischief from Lonerism, like you'll hear a massive difference. So they're a little bit more static and they have less character to them, but then I think that's where the bass comes in and really sort of gives it a little bit more syncopation and groove, and then you've got the synths that sort of layer up the rest of the track. So that's pretty much like what I feel in regards to like the musical side of Currents. But now let's look at the lyrical side of Currents. So I feel like this album is so introvert coded. Like, and even if you just look at the names of the past two albums that Tame Impala released, like Inner Speaker and Lonerism, like, I feel like that just is foreboding sort of the style that Kevin Parker has with his lyrics. And I've done a bit of songwriting in my life. I was really into it when I was like 13. And like, I just went full nerd. I went full hyperfixate on it. And I remember like analyzing all of these songs and analyzing all of these lyrics. And what I found is that I could like categorize, there are two different types of lyrics for me that I found very impactful. The first type of lyric was they were always very poetic. You know, they harness a lot of descriptions, poetic devices, they're very dramatic, they usually are there for storytelling, they have like metaphors and imagery, and these lyrics are basically like an artistic product of what you're trying to create through your lyrics. Like there's lots of frills, there's lots of bows. An example that I could just like pull off the top of my head is like Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift uses a lot of this in her lyrics. You know, it's all about imagery. It's all about describing the dresses that she's wearing or describing the smells. It's very artistic. And then the other category is like this category of lyric where they are just simple, plain words put together. There's no frills, there's no bows, there's no like artistic product of it. It's just words stringed together, but they are so relatable because of like this baseline of cold, hard honesty that I feel like a lot of people can relate to, because these words feel like a thought and have been a thought that we have had. Or, it's something that you would just naturally say in a conversation. It doesn't sound like something that has been dramatized or been like manipulated to sound more poetic, or, it's just cold, hard honesty. And I feel like a lot of the lyrics in Currents are very much in that second category. I feel like they're so honest. They feel like it's this simple stream of conscious thought that hasn't been altered, and that's why it's so impactful, because it's just so honest and a lot of us can relate to it. And don't get me wrong, I feel like Parker does have moments where he does like dramatize and it's like poetic and stuff, but most of the lyrics I find in this album is like, it's almost like showcasing this inner dialogue, which I really like, especially because it's paired with such a psychedelic influence of music. It's sort of like diving into this inner reflection and inner monologue that we all might have. And when I was researching, a lot of things that came up for this album is that like it very much was about heartbreak and about growth. What I feel though is I just feel like this album really perfectly showcases these feelings of expecting to be a perfect person, but then eventually accepting that you are actually not that person. You haven't met those expectations, and accepting that flawed personality of yours. And I feel like that just gives it a whole level of relatability. Pure example of that is the track The Less I Know, The Better. Ideally you want to be the person that gets the girl, but you're not. You're the person caught in a love triangle, and you're the person on the sidelines, and you're telling yourself, the less I know, the better. I don't want to know. Because I'm a man. Ideally you would be that bigger, better person in a fight. You would override this need to be right, or this sense of pride, but you don't. And then like the whole theme of the song is basically to like mask that flaw within masculinity. Or the track The Moment, I feel like the lyrics are very much like anticipate this moment that's going to happen, and ideally you would be a person that would be like, okay, like I'm ready for this moment to happen. But the lyrics really reflect this sort of doubtful, uncertain, and anxious anticipation of it. And then even just like the end track, New Person, Same Old Mistakes. I think that's the perfect track to end the album on, because it's almost like we've gone through this whole sort of growth. There are like, these undertones of heartbreak. And then at the end, it's like, same old mistakes. Like, and again, ideally you would be a person that's like, hey, I'm a new person. It's just like those New Year's resolutions that we talked about at the beginning of the podcast. I'm a new person. Hello, welcome. I'm not going to make the same mistakes again. But hey, he does. And it's almost like you're sort of caught in this circle of, just being this person that you don't want to be. So I feel like a lot of the songs on this album really sort of showcase that like sort of inner dialogue of, just being like this flawed character that's sort of reflecting on who they should be, but then accepting who they actually are. Like the lyrics can be quite doubtful. They're quite insecure at times. And when you look at the fact that Tame Impala has been a solo project by Kevin Parker, it sort of makes a lot of sense. When I was prepping for this podcast, I was reading a couple of articles as well, just like how Parker, creates his music, sort of what his process is. And especially for this album, a lot of it was he just shut himself in his studio and like he just pumped out an album. And I think that introversion and that willingness to sort of work by yourself on something, I feel like the lyrics are very much laced with that. So that's what I have to say about the lyrics. And I want to quickly go into two tracks which sort of play off of this like psychedelic feel. First one is the 8th track of the album, and that's Past Life. And I think this track is like a perfect example of this whole stream of consciousness style of lyric that the album has, because at this point the lyrics aren't even sung. There's just like, there is singing, but most of it is backed with like this commentary. And this track is a perfect example of like depersonalization and has that real psychedelic influence, because most of the song is like very much these disorientating sounds. There are these panning filters, there are these different synths that come in and then like go out. There's like no real structure to it. It's almost like you're going on some sort of journey. And I really like that the foundation of this song is this experience of seeing like your ex out somewhere. I don't know, at the shops, in public, somewhere. Because I feel like this sound, as like weird and wacky and disorientating as it is, I think it just perfectly encapsulates, that moment that you see someone, you see a past lover or you see an ex at the shops and you just don't expect it, obviously. And it's almost just like, it's that moment where like your belly drops, your palms start to become really sweaty because you're just so caught off of guard. And then all of a sudden, like your soul leaves your body. And then the sound of this track, I feel like is like the background music of just going through all of these flashbacks of you being together, sewn into this involuntary like biopic of when you guys were together. It just perfectly encapsulates that experience. And then almost like at the end of the track, it's like you've come back down to earth. You're out of like this whole flashback and only like a second has passed. I really feel like that's what this track is, or at least that's how I interpret it. There's all of these modulating filters that are sweeping through the sound spectrum. There is like this sort of soundscape in the background. You've obviously got this commentary, this sort of low voice. It's like you're in your head thinking about this. There's this clipping distortion. I love it. And like, I remember even listening to this song for the first time in the shower. I actually listened to this whole album in the shower. It was one of my favorite albums to listen to, obviously, in the bathroom of like a beat up apartment in South Yarra in Melbourne. And like the bathroom was also like from the 80s. I feel like the landlord was just very stubborn at not wanting to renovate it at all. So I was in like this 80s or like 70s bathroom. So it's just like these gross pink tiles and flowers everywhere. I had this shower curtain that was just horrible. And like the bath was like this blue ceramic color, and just listening to this song in this bathroom, just steam everywhere. It was just a beautiful moment, really. That's like one of the tracks I think where he really sort of hones into, like this disorientating psychedelic sound. And it also happens in Nangs, which acts as a little bit of like an interlude track. The last song, obviously, I want to talk about is The Less I Know, The Better. This episode wouldn't be complete if I didn't mention it. Love this song. Love it. As someone that is chronically caught in love triangles and is always like the losing party, I feel so seen in this track. I feel like it's also an example of the strongest melody in this album. It really plays off of this high register that Kevin Parker sings in. It's that high falsetto voice. And yeah, I feel like the melody sort of really leans into that part of his voice. It's very memorable. It's very dreamy. It really embraces that ethereal tone that has become a signature sound to Tame Impala. But also one thing I want to mention is the music video, because you know me, I love it when music and visuals sort of come together to create something cool. I love the music video. There's like a drippy paint sequence that happens where there's just like all these colors of paint like dripping down on a body. Love that. I love the unhinged King Kong love triangle. But specifically what I want to talk about is there's a sequence over the bridge of the song. So it's at the end of the song, and what it is, it's this sort of montage, and it's very psychedelic as well, and it's a bunch of drawings, it's like the girl, sort of like the main girl in the music video, it's like her body, it's this gorilla that she's in love with, and then there are all of these objects, there are all of these moments that sort of come together and are created into this massive sort of like flashback, but it's all in like drawings and animations. And to me, I feel like that as well is another really good example of just like playing off of this psychedelic aesthetic, but then using that as a vessel to really show this visceral moment of heartbreak. All of these drawings sort of like mashed together is just like a really great depiction of that feeling that you get when you see someone that you like and you see them with someone else for the first time. and you're totally, again, blindsided by it. All of your insides, your stomach, your heart just like drops down. It's like, it's no longer, there's nothing in your body. You're just like a ghost. You're a shell of a human being. So all of that is gone. But then, at least for me, when this happened to me, and it's happened to me so many times, it's these rush of thoughts where it's just like, you think about like when you hung out together, you think about that kiss that you had, you think about all the words that they said, you think about what you said, and then you think about, did I say something wrong? Did I not see this? Was I supposed to see this? Am I a fool? Oh my God, everyone is looking at me. I'm such a fool. Why did I do this? I knew this was going to happen. Boom. Like, just all of those feelings, all of those thoughts. I feel like psychedelic music is a really good reflection of just like being able to observe, maybe just like abstract things such as feelings that maybe you just don't really know to process. But then when you hear it as a sound or you see it as like a visual representation, it just makes so much more sense. So that's what I have to say about that song. So yeah, Currents. That's Currents by Tame Impala. Okay, now we're going to be looking into what you guys had to say about this album. And this was probably the album that had the most replies. So I posted it as a reel and I got a lot of views, but I didn't get as many comments as I thought I would. And I thought maybe that was because the comments were public. So then I posted a story and I got a lot of you guys sending in what you thought about the album. So we're just going to go into a couple of things that you guys said. Okay, so one person says, and this is on the comment of the reel, one person says the ultimate breakup/heartbreak album, which I totally agree with. For me, it's more about like accepting flaws. It's maybe more going through that growth period with undertones of heartbreak, but that's basically the same thing. One person says, I love that album, reminds me of summer. Yeah, it's a very summer album. I remember driving down to Melbourne because my parents live in New South Wales, and I remember driving through the mountain range listening to this album in summer one time, and it was just such a vibe. Someone says, I'll be honest, a bit overrated in my opinion. It's still a great album. I think it's the weakest of all of his releases. Still got some great jams, however, I think it has some of his worst songs as well. Overall, it's like a 7 out of 10 for me. I mean, that's a pretty good rating, 7 out of 10. But I sort of get what you mean. And maybe this is where this person probably liked the older Tame Impala more. So that earthy, sort of grounded psychedelic rock. Someone says, Lonerism is what got me into Tame Impala, but this is still a solid album. And if we look into the story, my story was where I got most of my replies. There's a lot of one-word answers. Amazing. Omniscient. Omniscient. I don't know how to pronounce that properly. Omniscient. Slay. Art. Goated for real. Someone said it's fine. Perfect. Amazing. Wonderful. Sorry, if you hear a cat meowing in the background, I live with a really old cat. He's like 20 years old. And he sleeps most of the day, but when he doesn't sleep, he roams around the house and just meows a lot. So if you hear him in the background, I'm sorry. That's Jimmy. I'm not feeding him. He's had too much food already. Okay, and then looking into some more of the longer responses. We've got someone that says their best album, hands down, would buy it on vinyl, but bums me that it's a double album. Someone says it's a great album for sure. So many iconic songs on it. We've got someone that says good start to finish album. Defined the transitioning sound of Tame Impala. It moves you. Someone says emotional damage, and I think that's that meme. Someone says the closest vaporwave got to being mainstream. Oh my god. Vaporwave? What is that? Is it like synthwave? Okay, this is just from the Wikipedia page. Vaporwave is a microgenre of electronic music and a subgenre of hauntology, a visual art style and an internet meme that emerged in the early 2010s. It is defined partly by its slowed down, chopped and screwed samples of smooth jazz, 1970s elevator music, R&B, and lounge music from the 1980s and 1990s. Wow! 1970s elevator music, what is that? That's so niche. The surrounding subculture is sometimes associated with an ambiguous or satirical take on consumer capitalism and pop culture, and tends to be characterized by a nostalgic or surrealist engagement with the popular entertainment, technology, and advertising of previous decades. Interesting. I never have heard of Vaporwave before. How interesting. Someone says phenomenal and trippy. Definitely agree. Someone says some songs felt a little bit repetitive, but otherwise it's just a pleasant album. Someone says it's absolutely a modern day classic. Ooh, someone says definitely a change of tune that Kevin had to make to avoid being pigeonholed. That's interesting. I would love to have a conversation on this podcast about like the evolution of an artist's sound, because I feel like that can really be something that polarizes their community. I know that a lot of people will go on about like how an artist, they were better back then, and the sound that they created first up was better than what they're creating now. And I feel like there is always this opposition to change and the evolution of oneself, which I think just goes completely against being human. I think we all change, even if we don't want to, Even in the space of 5 years, I feel like you become a completely different person, even if you're unaware to it. And naturally, being an artist or being a creative is obviously very entwined with just like being human and living life's experiences and being able to communicate that and relate it to, some sort of creative medium. And I know that there is also this fear within artists, and I know that I definitely have this with my mini album series, when you find the thing that people like, and then you just keep on replicating it, and people just want more and more and more of it, there gets to a point in time where you've replicated it so much that you're almost like, okay, there needs to be some sort of change. There needs to be some sort of evolution, otherwise I feel like I'm just running in circles, because I know what people like and I keep on giving them what they like, but I'm not changing and growing as an artist. Maybe you do want to evolve in different avenues. And I feel like a perfect example is this podcast I created. For a long while, I did paint these mini albums, and I always enjoyed doing that. And I started last winter, so a year ago, and I created them all through the winter, through the spring and the summer. And then when it sort of hit autumn of this year, I had a massive holiday and a massive break, and it was always on my mind that I really wanted to somehow convert what I'm doing into something else that is going to be a little bit more sustainable. And, one thing that I really like is that I obviously really like music, but a lot of people just knew me for my paintings and for my designs under Zigentala. And now I'm sort of in like that weird period where I'm sort of trying to convert, these paintings into something that's a little bit more larger, something that's a little bit more long form. I think about that when this person says, definitely a change of tune that Kevin had to make to avoid being pigeonholed, because then, when you do something for such a long time, people obviously know you for that thing, but then, it doesn't really give you many options to sort of change. Oh, someone says, I hate Tame Impala. Fanbase relentlessly meat rides him for no reason. Mindless indie rock. And that's totally fair. I honestly feel like I need more opposing opinions in these replies, because most of the time it is people being like, it's amazing, it's great. And it's like, well, I know it's great and amazing, but I also want someone to challenge that, but in a constructive way. But you know what? I'm very embracing of people that hate these albums as well. Lots of, wonderful, perfect, I like it, very talented and super catchy. Someone says, it feels like it belongs to another reality. It creates a feeling of existing just beyond a thin veil. Someone says, oh my god, someone else knows Tame Impala? That's so weird. They're so underground. Okay. Someone says, great album. Music is amazing. Fandom makes me want to cry. I really want to talk about fandoms someday, guys, because painting these mini albums has made me sort of, I have my foot in a couple of fandoms, because people rush to my albums and tell me whether they're good or they're bad when I paint them. And oh my god, the Radiohead fandom is probably like the most intense fandom. I don't know, there's just so much angst in that fandom. But that's weird. I don't know if I have a feel for the Tame Impala fandom. Someone says it brings you to a completely different dimension. Someone says amazing album, one of my all-time favorites. B-side remixes are also amazing. Someone says less I know the better stopped me from having a nervous breakdown after my first edible. Oh my god. Oh, I love that for you. Someone says, good, but realistically, I'm only coming back for 4 songs. The less I know, the better, eventually, let it happen, and new person, same old mistakes. Oh, someone says, didn't listen to it, but I'll give it a try. That's actually something I really like about these comments, is that some people are like, don't know this album, but I trust you enough to listen to it. That's so nice. I mean, you might hate it, but like, this is what I really want to create. I really want to create like a listening, maybe if it's going to be like a channel on my Instagram or like a chat or something. I really want to create like a listening party or something where like I can give you guys like a heads up on I'm going to be doing this album like a week in advance, and then you can listen to it as well, and then you can give more of an input, or if you haven't listened to the album you can. I think that'd be really cool. Someone says very good but a little overrated. I think he has better albums. Someone says my Roman Empire. Another one is most of the songs I wouldn't go out of my way to listen to, but they all work together so well to create a vibe. Another one is the album, it's like a wine, much better over the years. Someone says pretty mid, but you hot damn, Alanis' daughter. Is that Alanis Morissette? Yeah. I could be her daughter, couldn't I? That's such a funny comment. There was also, I have to try and find it. There was also someone on the story. I just remembered it now. So someone commented on the reel. They said the ultimate breakup / heartbreak album. And then under that, the comments were, one person said exactly, one person said 100%. And then another person said, man, I can't even listen to it anymore. And I'm starting to dislike it because he was like the only artist I was listening to when I was still talking with her. And I'm assuming he's talking about a past lover. And that's, I feel that as well. Because when I was listening to Currents, like I was a mess, you know, and it's just interesting that emotional imprint that you put on an album when you listen to it at a certain time in your life. I remember the time, I remember the person, I remember everything listening to this song. You know, when you listen to it, the feelings numb over time. That's all I have to say about that. Okay, well, that's what you guys had to say about it. Thank you so much for sending your replies in. And now we're going to be talking about the psychedelic movement and its roots in the 1960s counterculture. So obviously, like I've said through this podcast, Tame Impala has a very heavy psychedelic influence in its sound. And so this sound came from the psychedelic movement, which was a subculture in the 1960s. And it was part of a greater movement called the counterculture of the 1960s. The psychedelic movement was influenced by the sudden emergence of recreational use of psychedelic drugs, such as LSD. And then that would go on to inspire a whole subculture where you obviously had psychedelic music, there was psychedelic fashion, there was psychedelic visual art. And obviously that was a point in time, that was a subculture that emerged. Now, I just want to quickly get into definitions. So a subculture is a group of people within a society that differentiates themselves from the standard mainstream culture. And although a group's morals, art, music, and values may differ from that of the mainstream, they still are able to exist within a mainstream society. So other examples of subcultures include bikers, goths, punks, hippies, everything like that. And subcultures tend to be more around the individual self-expression and sort of like the belonging of that culture. So a counterculture is something that's a little bit more extreme. It's a movement that advocates for different values and morals that directly defy the ones of a mainstream society. And so the whole point of a counterculture is that it cannot peacefully exist within a mainstream society because these values have sort of emerged in the hope to change the society to make it a more just and better functioning place. So that's the difference. Subcultures are a little bit more, it's like a group within a mainstream society where you can sort of belong, express, they do have different values and morals, but they can peacefully exist within a mainstream society, whereas a counterculture is a little bit more, we're trying to change the way that people think. Our thoughts and morals directly oppose the ones that are happening right now in society, and we want to change that. And with the 1960s counterculture movement, this was especially a very important movement because it did gain so much traction that it changed the way that the Western world operated and influenced massive things that created the culture that we live in now. As a general explanation, the 1960s counterculture was basically an anti-establishment movement. And this was where people were sort of questioning a lot of the things of the society and the time because there were lots of tensions happening. So there was like the growing tensions of the Vietnam War. So people were questioning war. So there was an anti-war movement. We had people questioning authority and political power. We had people questioning, the power and the existential threat of nuclear weapons. We also saw so many more social issues arise, like the problem of segregation from the civil rights movement. There was also the advocacy for freedom of speech. Environmentalism started to emerge as a result of industrialism. You also have the advocacy of feminism and women's rights, which was already being revolutionized by the invention of birth control, which created the sexual revolution. You also have roots at the beginning of the gay liberation movement. There was just so many things happening in the 1960s. And basically what people were doing was, they were anti-establishment. There was, and I think this is where the psychedelic movement sort of slipped in, there was more emphasis on peace, anti-war. There was more advocacy for social rights that hadn't really been touched on before. And because this counterculture created such traction, it did revolutionize pop culture and revolutionize the way that the Western world operated, and the psychedelic movement was a part of this whole, this thought of the expansion of the consciousness, questioning the systems that we were born in and questioning the things that have been set out for us. And, is this right? Is this just? Is this ethical? This is where I pose the question, because when I was looking and researching about the 1960s counterculture, oh my God, like the parallels I could draw from the 1960s to the 2020s right now just made me wonder and realize, one, are we currently in a counterculture? Are we going to look back at the 2020s as a counterculture? Or are we going to eventually get to a tipping point within, this decade of the 2020s where we're going to see a massive shift in society? Because I'm not going to lie, the emergence of the counterculture in the 1960s came from this foundation of tension and turmoil in society. And right now, tell me you don't see or feel that. But this also has to do with generations. I am a millennial by a year. I am the younger millennials. But I also resonate and partake in Gen Z culture, and I grew up with millennial culture, but I was always too young to participate in it. So I feel like I'm just caught. There's a couple of years of us that I think are just caught in that rift between millennial and Gen Z, where it's just sort of on that cusp and can't really decide which one we are. I really feel that in my section of generation, so younger millennials and Gen Z, there is so much that we are questioning, and there is so much shift in the morals of what we have compared to the older generations. And I know that happens from generation to generation, but I feel like this one is a little bit bigger. Just think about the fact that, the 2020s started off with a pandemic where we essentially were questioning things like work. We were questioning politics. We were questioning authorities. Something was happening in this world. Nobody knew why. Nobody knew what to do. And I feel like that started everything off. And now we're sort of still seeing the effects of the pandemic now, but we're also have this increasing awareness of the wealth gap. And, we're questioning billionaires. We're questioning corporations. We were also all going through a cost of living crisis. We're going through a massive year, 2 years, I don't know how many years of inflation. We're in a very unstable economy. There are increasing civil tensions in countries like the US, and we've got like the US election coming up this year. I don't even know how that's going to go. And you might question me being like, why is a Australian living in Switzerland feel like they have a say in US politics? I feel like I've got a say because like the US political landscape literally dictates what happens in this world, and I'm a part of that world. Yeah, you've got like increasing international tensions like NATO and Russia. You've got this horrible genocide that's happening over in Gaza. You've got the rise of technology. We're all questioning the power of the internet, the power of social media, the ethics of AI. And then on top of that as well, we've got global warming literally like knocking at the door. It is here, There are flowers growing in Antarctica. We're recording some of the hottest years on record. We're seeing such extreme weather events even in this decade. Like we started 2020 off in Australia with the 2020 bushfires, which was obviously devastating. We obviously had floods a couple of years later. We had the fires in Maui and Hawaii. And then you've got the bushfires in Canada from last year. And so I feel like this is like the turmoil that a lot of the younger generations, like Gen Z and younger millennials, and maybe the whole of millennials too as well. But it's like, we've had this whole life set out in front of us where it's like you go to school, you get a degree, you get a full-time job so you can get a house and you can start a family, and you work a 9 to 5 so that you can create a retirement fund so that when you reach a certain age, you can enjoy your life. And I feel like the younger generations, housing is questionable. I feel like a lot of people are questioning families, especially there's a massive shift in women, I feel like I'm a part of that as well, where we're questioning, maybe having a family, having a baby, having a child isn't the be all and end all of my existence. Maybe there's something more to life, but that's all I've been told. But that doesn't seem like a viable decision, because how the hell am I supposed to support a child, let alone support myself? There is so much tension, and you can see it a lot online as well on the internet. You can feel it in real life. I don't think it's just through my generation and the younger generations, but it's just like at some point, if we're not already in it now, when are we going to reach this tipping point where things need to change? This system needs to change. Are we going to get to that point? Yeah, it's just really interesting. And that was just like a massive thought I had when I was looking into the 1960s, because I'm like, yeah, this is now. I don't mean to get all existential and political on this podcast, but one thing you need to understand, and I keep on saying it, is that music is a big reflection of the people and the time and its society. And obviously we saw the emergence of a subculture called like the psychedelic movement. People were a lot more into the expansion of the consciousness, and I think that really went hand in hand with the expansion of like this view on life, and whether, these things like war and these things like the nuclear weapons, is this something that we should be doing? Is this something that the world should have? And, and we're living in that right now. But obviously you don't really know the era that you're living in when you're living in it, because you have to look back at it because it has like a crystallization period. But it just makes you wonder as well, because if there's going to be a counterculture, it's like, will there also be like some subcultures that come from that? And will that influence music and art in the next 50 years? Like psychedelic has influenced, these psychedelic revival bands like Tame Impala. Who knows? But you heard it from here first. So yeah, that's what I had to say. Psychedelic movements, psychedelic subculture, counterculture of the 1960s. I hope you learned something, and I hope you become a little bit more observant of the people around you, of the culture that is shifting. And maybe, yeah, it's happening right now. So that is all from me today, guys. Thank you so much for listening. Please make sure to give my podcast a rating. I've got 6 ratings now. One of them is from my mum, I'm pretty sure. But thank you so much for watching. I did say in the last podcast that Currents by Tame Impala will be the last album that I do in chronological order from my mini denim tote bag. And here it is, if you're watching the video. Here she is. She's been hanging around. She's been lounging around my bedroom. So those are the first 3 albums I painted in chronological order. And I said that I was going to end it on Currents by Tame Impala and then go to something random, but I've changed my mind. The next album I'm going to do is Igor by Tyler, the Creator. I was thinking of doing Flower Boy first, but I want to do Igor. So that's going to be the next album. And I'm already behind. But yeah, I'm going to be asking you guys what you think about the album, so definitely stay tuned for that if you want to have your little input. Thank you so much for listening and watching. I will see you in the next episode, and yeah, take care, have a good time, listen to good music, and I shall see you soon. Bye bye.